At my granddaughter's wedding, my name tag called me the old lady paying for everything, and I smiled because they had no idea what that would cost them. The ballroom at the Grand Lakeside Hotel shimmered with soft gold light, crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, and for a moment, it looked exactly like the kind of day I had dreamed of for my granddaughter Emily. I had spent months making sure every detail was perfect, from the ivory roses flown in from California to the string quartet tuning their instruments near the aisle, every choice made with the quiet hope that this would be a day our family would remember with warmth. At 68, I had learned not to expect much in return for my efforts, but I still believed that moments like this meant something, that they revealed who we truly were to one another. I approached the reception table slowly, smoothing the front of my pale blue dress, the same shade my late husband once said made my eyes look brighter, and I remember thinking how proud he would have been to see Emily standing at the center of it all. The young woman at the check-in table handed me my name tag with a practiced smile, and I glanced down casually, expecting to see Margaret Hayes, grandmother of the bride. Something simple, something respectful. Instead, written in elegant black script, were the words "the old lady paying for everything." For a second I thought it was a mistake, the kind of small error that happens in the chaos of weddings, but the ink was too deliberate, the phrasing too precise, like a quiet joke meant for everyone else to understand. My fingers tightened slightly around the card, but I didn't say anything. I pinned it to my dress with steady hands, lifting my chin just enough to keep my composure intact, because I had spent too many years learning that dignity is not something you surrender in front of an audience. As I stepped into the ballroom, the music swelled gently, guests laughed over glasses of champagne, and everything appeared exactly as it should have been, except for the subtle shift in the air that only I seemed to notice. A few glances lingered a second too long. A whisper stopped. As I passed, someone's smile faltered when their eyes flicked toward my chest. I walked forward anyway, each step measured, each breath controlled, telling myself that perhaps I was reading too much into it, that maybe this was nothing more than a thoughtless attempt at humor. But deep down, something settled cold and heavy in my chest, the quiet understanding that this wasn't an accident, that somewhere behind the polished decorations and carefully arranged tables, there was a version of me being presented to the world that I had never agreed to. I spotted my son Richard near the bar, laughing with a group of guests, his posture relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he had noticed, if he had seen the words pinned to me like a label I hadn't chosen. He glanced in my direction, our eyes meeting for just a fraction of a second, and then he looked away, lifting his glass as if nothing at all was out of place. That was when the last bit of doubt faded. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a message, carefully placed where I couldn't ignore it, dressed up as a joke so no one would have to take responsibility for it. I adjusted the edge of my sleeve, smoothed the fabric once more, and allowed a small, polite smile to settle on my face, the kind I had worn through decades of family gatherings, through moments that required silence more than truth. Because if there was one thing I understood better than anyone in that room, it was this: people always reveal who they are when they think you won't respond. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let them keep talking. I remained seated for a few minutes longer than necessary, allowing the rhythm of the room to settle around me, watching how easily people moved from one conversation to another, how effortlessly laughter filled the spaces between polite introductions, and how quickly I had become something to observe rather than someone to include. When I finally stood, I did so with the same measured grace I had practiced for years, not drawing attention, not inviting sympathy, simply existing as I always had. I made my way toward the buffet table, passing clusters of guests who shifted slightly to make room, their smiles courteous but distant, and it was there, near the far end of the room, that the illusion finally gave way to something unmistakably real. Pamela's voice carried just enough to reach me, light and amused, the kind of tone people use when they believe they are being clever without consequence. She was speaking to a group of her friends, women I recognized only from previous gatherings, their expressions attentive and entertained as she gestured casually in my direction. "Well, you know how it is," she said, her voice lilting with a confidence that suggested this was not the first time she had told this story. "Some people just prefer to contribute financially instead of, actually being involved." A soft ripple of laughter followed, not loud enough to draw a scene, but clear enough to confirm that the meaning had landed exactly as intended. One of the women leaned closer, lowering her voice but not enough to escape notice entirely. "So she really paid for all of this?" she asked, her tone edged with curiosity rather than gratitude. Pamela smiled, tilting her head slightly as if considering how best to phrase her answer, though there was no hesitation in her delivery. "Let us just say," she replied, "it makes things a lot easier when you have someone who does not mind being the family's safety net." The phrase lingered in the air, delicate on the surface but sharp beneath, and for a moment time seemed to slow just enough for me to feel the full weight of it. I stood still, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, not turning toward them, not interrupting, simply listening as the final pieces fell into place. There was no confusion left, no room for doubt or misunderstanding. This was not a careless joke or an isolated moment of poor judgment. It was a narrative carefully constructed and comfortably repeated, one that reduced years of support, of quiet generosity, into something transactional and convenient. I felt a brief flicker of something I might once have called hurt, but it passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something clearer. I straightened slightly, adjusting the line of my shoulders, and reached for a plate, moving through the motions as if nothing had shifted, even though everything had. As I turned away, I caught sight of Richard again, standing only a few feet from Pamela, close enough that he could not have missed her words, and yet he said nothing. He did not correct her, did not step in, did not even glance in my direction this time. Instead, he nodded along with the conversation, his expression neutral, as though what was being said required no response at all. That was the moment I understood something I had not allowed myself to fully accept before. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is agreement. I placed a small portion of food onto my plate, though I had no appetite, and moved back toward my table, each step steady, each breath even, aware now that whatever this evening was meant to be, it was no longer about celebration. It was about revelation. And the truth, once seen clearly, has a way of changing everything that comes after. I returned to my seat without hurry, placing the untouched plate in front of me as if I had every intention of enjoying the meal, though my appetite had quietly disappeared somewhere between Pamela's laughter and Richard's silence. The music continued, soft and elegant, filling the space in a way that almost made it possible to pretend nothing had changed. But once something is seen clearly, it does not return to its former shape. I folded my hands gently in my lap and let my eyes move across the room again. Not searching this time, simply observing with a kind of calm that only comes when uncertainty has been replaced by understanding. It was strange in a way how quickly the past began to rearrange itself in my mind, each memory shifting slightly, aligning with what I now knew to be true. I thought about the first time Pamela had suggested that I handle the down payment for their house, how she had framed it as a temporary favor, something that would make things easier for everyone. I remembered the way Richard had stood beside her, nodding, assuring me that it was only for a short while, that they would take care of the rest. I had not hesitated then. I had believed that helping family was not something to question. Then there had been the tuition payments for Emily's college, the unexpected medical bills, the renovations that seemed to grow larger with each passing month. Each time there had been a reason, a carefully explained necessity, and each time, I had agreed without asking for anything in return, not even acknowledgement, because I had convinced myself that love did not keep accounts. But now, sitting there beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, I could see how each of those moments had been part of something larger, something quieter and far more deliberate than I had allowed myself to notice. It was not that I had been forced or pressured. It was that I had been guided, gently and consistently, into a role that served them well and diminished me at the same time. I recalled small details I had once dismissed, the way Pamela would correct me in front of others with a polite smile, the way decisions about family gatherings were made without consulting me, the subtle shift in tone when my contributions were mentioned, always framed as expected rather than appreciated. Even the wedding itself, which I had believed was a shared effort, now felt different when viewed through this lens. I remembered the planning meetings where my suggestions were acknowledged but rarely followed, the budget discussions where my input seemed less important than my willingness to cover the cost. None of it had seemed significant on its own. Together, it formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. I lifted my gaze once more and found Pamela again, still moving easily among the guests, her confidence unchanged, her laughter unrestrained, as if the foundation beneath her had never been questioned. Richard stood nearby, speaking with someone from his office, his expression relaxed, his posture unburdened. They looked comfortable, secure in a reality that had worked in their favor for a long time. I felt no urge to confront them, no sudden need to correct the narrative in that moment. Instead, there was a quiet clarity that settled over me, steady and unshakable. I understood now that what had been built over the years was not simply a family dynamic but an arrangement, one that depended on my silence as much as it depended on my generosity. And arrangements, I had learned, can be changed. I adjusted the edge of my napkin, placing it neatly beside my plate, and allowed a faint smile to return, not for their benefit but for my own. Because the more I considered everything that had led to this moment, the more certain I became that this evening was not the end of something, but the beginning of a shift they had not yet anticipated. The evening moved forward with the same polished rhythm, speeches beginning, glasses raised, and applause offered at all the right moments, but I no longer followed it the way I had intended when I first arrived. Instead, I watched with a different kind of attention, one that no longer focused on celebration but on understanding. It was during one of these quiet observations that I noticed someone standing just beyond the edge of the main crowd, a familiar figure who did not quite belong to the easy flow of conversation. Mr. Harrison had always carried himself that way, slightly removed, as if he preferred clarity over comfort, and seeing him there brought with it a sense of grounding I had not expected. He had been my husband's attorney for over 30 years, a man who valued precision and never spoke without purpose. When our eyes met, he gave a small, acknowledging nod, not intrusive, not overly familiar, simply present in a way that felt deliberate. I rose from my seat and made my way toward him, each step steady, aware that this was not coincidence. "Margaret," he said as I approached, his voice calm and even, the same tone he had used in countless meetings over the years. "I was hoping I would see you here." There was something in the way he said it that suggested intention rather than chance, and I returned his greeting with a quiet smile. "It has been a while," I replied, keeping my voice light, though I sensed there was more beneath the surface. He glanced briefly around the room, taking in the setting, the guests, the atmosphere that appeared flawless to anyone who did not look too closely. "It certainly has," he said, then paused just long enough to shift the tone of the conversation. "Your husband asked me to keep certain matters in order, even after he was gone." I felt a subtle tightening in my chest at the mention of him, not from pain, but from the weight of unfinished things. Mr. Harrison continued, his words measured, each one placed carefully. "There are provisions that were designed with specific circumstances in mind," he said, not lowering his voice, but speaking in a way that naturally limited who would listen. "Circumstances that involve how you are treated within your own family." I did not interrupt. I did not ask for clarification. I simply listened because something told me that this was not the moment for questions, but for understanding. He studied my expression for a brief second, as if confirming something he had already suspected, then added, "Your husband believed in protecting what he built, but more importantly, he believed in protecting you." The words settled quietly, carrying more meaning than their simplicity suggested. Around us, laughter continued, glasses clinked, and the music shifted into a livelier tune. But in that moment, everything seemed to narrow into a single clear line of thought. "There are conditions attached," he said, his tone unchanged, as if discussing something entirely routine. "Conditions that depend not on what is said in private, but on what is demonstrated openly." I held his gaze, feeling the full implication of what he was offering without needing every detail spelled out. This was not a warning. It was not advice. It was information given at precisely the moment it would matter most. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging without drawing attention, and allowed a small, composed smile to return to my face. "Thank you," I said simply, because anything more would have been unnecessary. He gave a slight nod in return, the kind that marked the end of a conversation without closing the door on what might follow. As I turned back toward the center of the room, the noise and movement of the celebration resumed their place around me, but something fundamental had shifted. The uncertainty that had lingered earlier was gone, replaced by a clarity that felt almost calm. I adjusted the edge of my dress, straightened my posture, and stepped forward once more, aware now that this evening was unfolding on more than one level. And for the first time since I arrived, I was no longer simply observing what was happening. I was preparing for what would come next. I stepped back into the current of the evening with a steadiness that felt different from before. Not forced, not rehearsed, but rooted in something quieter and far more certain. The music had shifted into a brighter tempo, and guests were beginning to gather closer to the dance floor, drawn by the promise of celebration that still lingered on the surface. I moved among them with the same composed expression, acknowledging greetings, offering brief responses, allowing the illusion to remain intact for anyone who needed it. But inside I was no longer reacting. I was observing with intention. Every glance, every word, every small gesture now carried meaning, and I let it all unfold without interference. Pamela noticed me again as I approached the edge of the main group, her smile widening just slightly, the kind of expression that suggested confidence rather than warmth. "Margaret," she said, her tone light, drawing the attention of those nearby as if my presence required a subtle announcement. "I hope you are enjoying everything. It is exactly how we envisioned it." There was a careful emphasis on the last phrase, one that excluded without ever stating it directly. I returned her gaze calmly, allowing a small, polite smile to form. "It is certainly memorable," I replied, my voice even, offering nothing more than the words themselves. A few people around us exchanged quick glances, sensing something beneath the surface but unable to name it. Pamela let out a soft laugh, brushing an invisible crease from her dress as if the moment had already passed. "Well, none of it would have been possible without your generosity," she added, her tone shifting just enough to draw attention back to the role she had assigned me. "We are all very grateful, of course." The words sounded appropriate, but the delivery carried a different weight, one that placed me firmly in a position she believed I would accept without question. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without engaging with it, and allowed the silence that followed to stretch just long enough to become noticeable. It was a small thing, but I had learned that silence, when used carefully, can reveal more than conversation ever could. Someone nearby cleared their throat, another guest glanced toward the bar, and the moment dissolved without resolution. Pamela's smile remained, but there was a flicker of something else behind it now, something less certain, as if she had expected a different response and was adjusting in real time. I turned away gently, not abruptly, not in dismissal, simply shifting my attention elsewhere, because there was nothing to be gained from addressing her directly, not yet. The evening continued to build toward its next phase, speeches nearing their conclusion, the anticipation of the first dance settling over the room like a quiet signal. I took my place near the edge of the crowd once more, where I could see everything without being at the center of it, and allowed myself to breathe evenly, feeling the calm settle deeper with each passing moment. The conversation with Mr. Harrison replayed in my mind, not as a source of tension, but as a framework, a quiet structure beneath everything that was happening. Conditions that depended on what was demonstrated openly. The phrase remained with me, clear and precise, and I understood now that this was not about confrontation, not about defending myself or correcting anyone's perception in the moment. It was about allowing the truth to reveal itself fully, without interruption, without resistance. I watched as Pamela moved through the room again, her gestures confident, her laughter easy, unaware that the very things she believed reinforced her position were, in fact, shaping something entirely different. Richard followed closely, his presence steady but passive, as it had been all evening. Together they created an image that appeared stable, controlled, unquestioned. And yet, beneath that surface, something had already begun to shift. I adjusted the bracelet on my wrist, a simple habit that grounded me, and let my gaze settle forward, not on any one person, but on the room as a whole. The lights, the music, the carefully arranged details, all of it remained exactly as it had been when I first arrived. The only difference now was that I could see it clearly. And clarity, once gained, does not fade. It waits quietly until the moment it is needed most. The first dance began with a soft swell of music, the kind that draws every eye toward the center of the room, and for a moment, the entire evening seemed to gather itself into something almost sincere. Emily stepped onto the floor in her white gown, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the lights above her, and I felt a brief, quiet warmth at the sight of her, a reminder that not everything had been lost to the undercurrents of the night. Guests formed a loose circle, glasses in hand, conversations fading into a respectful hush as attention shifted to the couple. I moved closer as well, not to be seen but to see, positioning myself where I could observe without interruption, where every detail remained clear. Pamela stood just a few feet away, her posture relaxed, her expression bright as she leaned toward a small group, her voice carrying just enough to reach beyond its intended audience. "It is incredible how everything came together," she said, her tone light, almost reflective, though there was a sharpness beneath it that I had come to recognize. Of course, it helps when certain people prefer to contribute behind the scenes instead of, well, being part of the real moments. There was a pause, just long enough for the implication to settle, followed by a soft ripple of laughter that did not quite reach the level of the music but did not need to. I did not turn. I did not react. I let the words pass through the air as if they belonged to someone else's story, even though I knew they were meant for me. Another voice joined in, curious, almost playful. "So she did not want to be involved?" the woman asked, her tone suggesting she already believed the answer. Pamela gave a small, knowing smile, tilting her head slightly as she responded. "Let us just say," she replied, "everyone has their strengths." The phrasing was gentle, almost generous on the surface, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. I could feel the shift again, the subtle change in how those around her processed what they were hearing, how quickly perception could be shaped by repetition, by tone, by the careful absence of contradiction. I remained still, my gaze fixed on Emily as she moved gracefully across the floor, unaware of the narrative unfolding just beyond her reach. My hands rested calmly at my sides, my posture unchanged, because there was nothing to be gained from stepping into that circle of quiet mockery. Not yet. I understood now that what Pamela needed most was confirmation, a reaction that would allow her to define the moment fully, to frame me in a way that could not be questioned. And so I gave her none. I allowed the silence to remain intact, not as submission but as space for her words to stand on their own, for others to hear them without interference. Richard stood beside her again, his presence steady, his expression neutral as he nodded along with the conversation, offering no correction, no balance, only quiet reinforcement through absence. It was almost effortless, the way they moved together, one speaking, the other allowing it to continue, as if this had been practiced long before tonight. I drew a slow breath, feeling the calm settle deeper, not fragile, not forced, but grounded in something that no longer depended on their approval or understanding. Around us, the music swelled, applause rose as the dance came to a close, and the room returned to its rhythm of celebration, but beneath it all, something had reached its peak. The pattern was complete, no longer hinted at, no longer hidden behind polite gestures or careful wording. It was visible now, clear to anyone willing to see it. I shifted my weight slightly, adjusting my stance as the next part of the evening approached, aware that the space I had given them to reveal themselves had served its purpose. And as the applause faded and the attention of the room began to shift once more, I knew with quiet certainty that the moment I had been waiting for was no longer somewhere in the distance. It was approaching, steady and inevitable, shaped not by what I would say, but by everything they had already chosen to show. The applause softened into a gentle hum as guests returned to their conversations, the energy of the room shifting once again toward anticipation, as the master of ceremonies stepped forward to introduce the next part of the evening. Beaches. It was a familiar rhythm, one I had seen countless times, words offered in celebration, gratitude wrapped in polished sentences, carefully timed laughter filling the pauses. I remained where I stood for a moment longer, allowing the transition to settle, feeling the weight of everything that had unfolded not as a burden, but as a quiet alignment. When my name was mentioned, it came almost casually, as if it had been added as an afterthought rather than an intention. "And of course we would also love to hear a few words from Margaret," the host said, gesturing politely in my direction, his tone warm but neutral, unaware of the layers beneath the surface. For a brief second there was a flicker of surprise among those nearby, a subtle shift as attention turned toward me, some curious, others expectant, and a few I noticed suddenly still. I moved forward without hesitation, each step steady, my posture unchanged, the small, composed smile returning as naturally as breath. The microphone felt light in my hand, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with the moment itself, but with the many years I had spent standing in rooms where words carried weight. I did not rush. I did not look down. I allowed the quiet to settle fully before I began, giving the room time to listen, not just hear. Thank you, I said simply, my voice even, carrying clearly without force. It is a beautiful evening. A few nods, a few murmurs of agreement. Safe ground. I let my gaze move briefly across the room, not searching for anyone in particular, but acknowledging the presence of those gathered before continuing. Family celebrations have always meant a great deal to me, I added, choosing each word with care, allowing them to land without urgency. They are moments where we show each other who we are, not through grand gestures, but through the small ways we treat one another. There was a subtle shift then, barely noticeable but real. Conversations quieted just a little more. Attention sharpened. I continued, my tone unchanged, neither accusatory nor emotional, simply steady. Over the years, I have had the privilege of contributing to many of these moments, sometimes in ways that are visible, and sometimes in ways that are not. I paused briefly, not for effect, but because the silence itself carried meaning. And I have learned that what matters most is not the contribution itself, but the respect that surrounds it. The room grew still in a way that felt different from before, not uncertain but attentive. I could feel it without needing to see it directly. My late husband believed strongly in that principle. I went on, bringing his presence into the space with quiet intention. He believed that generosity should never come at the cost of dignity, and that how we treat one another in public reflects who we are in private. Few eyes shifted. A few expressions changed. I did not need to look at Pamela or Richard to know they were listening. He made certain arrangements to ensure that belief would be upheld, I said, my voice remaining calm, unhurried, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. Arrangements that are not based on intention, but on behavior. On what is demonstrated openly in moments just like this. The implication settled without resistance, not forced, not explained, simply present. I allowed another brief pause, letting the weight of it rest where it fell. Tonight has been very revealing, I added quietly, not as an accusation but as a statement, one that required no elaboration. Then, just as gently as I had begun, I brought the moment to its natural close. I wish Emily and her husband a lifetime of happiness, I said, turning the focus back to where it belonged, offering the sentiment sincerely, because not everything in this room had been altered. I lowered the microphone, my expression unchanged, and stepped back, the quiet following me not as tension, but as recognition. Whatever had been hidden before was no longer entirely unseen, and I knew, without needing confirmation, that the shift I had felt earlier had now moved beyond me and into the room itself. The silence that followed did not break immediately, it lingered, stretching across the room in a way that no music or polite applause could quickly erase, and for the first time that evening, I noticed that people were no longer looking past me, they were looking at me, not with curiosity, not with amusement, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding. I stepped away from the microphone without hurry, returning it to its place as if nothing unusual had happened, as if I had simply fulfilled a small role in the evening's program, but I could feel the shift in the air, subtle yet undeniable, like a current that had changed direction beneath the surface. Pamela was no longer speaking. Her posture remained composed, but the ease that had defined her earlier movements was gone, replaced by a stillness that suggested she was recalculating, adjusting to something she had not anticipated. Richard stood beside her, his expression no longer neutral, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead, as if he were trying to understand how a moment so carefully controlled had slipped beyond his reach. I did not approach them. I did not need to. The space between us now held more truth than any conversation could have carried. Around the room, conversations resumed slowly, but they were different, quieter, more measured, as if people were choosing their words with greater care, aware now that what was said in passing could carry further than intended. A woman who had laughed earlier avoided my gaze entirely, turning her attention to her glass as if it required sudden focus. Another offered a small, respectful nod as I passed, not exaggerated, not performative, simply present. It was not admiration and it was not sympathy. It was recognition. I moved toward the edge of the ballroom, where the tall windows reflected the soft glow of the lights inside, and paused for a moment, looking out at the darkened lake beyond, its surface still and undisturbed. The night air pressed lightly against the glass, cool and steady, and for the first time since I arrived, I allowed myself a full breath, unguarded and complete. Behind me, the music began again, lighter now, almost tentative, as if the room itself was finding its way back to balance. I adjusted the clasp of my purse and turned slightly, taking in the scene one last time, not with attachment but with clarity. Emily stood with her husband, surrounded by friends, her smile genuine, untouched by the undercurrents that had moved through the evening. That, at least, remained intact, and I was grateful for it in a quiet, uncomplicated way. Mr. Harrison caught my eye from across the room and gave a small, knowing nod, not seeking acknowledgement but offering it, a silent confirmation that what needed to be seen had been seen. I returned the gesture just as subtly, understanding without words that the next steps would not require urgency, only intention. I did not wait for anything further. I did not linger for explanations or apologies that might never come. Instead, I turned toward the exit, my step steady, my posture unchanged, moving through the room with the same quiet composure I had carried all evening, but now without the weight that had accompanied it before. No one stopped me. No one called after me. The doors opened smoothly, and the cool night air met me without resistance, clean and unburdened. As I stepped outside, the sounds of the celebration softened behind me, fading into something distant and indistinct, and I realized that I was not leaving something behind so much as stepping beyond it. Some things do not need to be taken back. Some things simply reveal their cost. And once you understand that, you no longer have to carry them at all.